want to thank all of you just for being an awesome church family. It's been great to be here. It's been a great way to get started. It's been great to work with these youth. Can we have another hand for these youth here? It's been a great experience, and I'm thankful for it. And I guess we'll just get rolling with the sermon now. Here's a picture. This is a birch blossom. It's in the spring. It's not spring right now, so this is something to look forward to. I don't like it when it snows and all that stuff. So if you look at this would really be a great picture to teach somebody about what a birch blossom looks like. You can look at the colors, you can look at the leaves, you can look at the stem that it's on. And so it represents a birch blossom. This is awesome. This is great. There we go. This is the same picture. But you wouldn't use this to talk about what a birch blossom looks like. You would use this to talk about a lake, or you see there's a little cabin in the back, there's some trees there. But it's the same, right? What's the difference? Focus, perspective. The word we're going with today is focus because that's what's in my next PowerPoint. Our focus determines what we really represent. And so this is the great big giant spoiler alert for this whole sermon. That's what we're talking about. And what we really want our focus to represent is Jesus. All the time. All the time. Turn in your Bibles to Numbers 21. We're going to be focusing in on verses 4 through 9. It's page 111 in your pew Bible. And while you get there, I want to tell you a little bit about how I've seen this work. I've done a lot of work with youth groups and stuff. I grew up in my home youth group. I was involved with them a lot. And one of the things that we did was go on these international missions trips. And so one of the places we went one year, I went as a leader, we went to Costa Rica. And part of that trip to Costa Rica was we took an afternoon and we went to a place that was called La Cuenca. And La Cuenca was a place where a lot of the more disadvantaged people, I don't know how exactly you want to say it, but it was a really, really poor community. The houses were made of tin, they weren't very big. And one of the first things we recognized, I grew up in a farm town, we were pretty sheltered. One of the things that we recognized right away coming into this community is that all the gray water, all the black water, all the sewage, all goes down into the creek, going through the community. And so there's trash in there, there's garbage in there, it's nasty, it's gross to us. To them, it's, it's a normal everyday thing. And that was the thing that stuck out to us. And so we did a Bible school in that community. We did a prayer walk in that community. But the thing that really impacted the community most, I'm certain of, a lot of the guys took some time to play soccer. And we played soccer with the men and the boys that didn't want to go to any of the Bible stuff. And so I got to be a part of that team. And we got our butts kicked, like real bad. But one of the things that happened was somebody kicked the ball, I think it was one of our guys, kicked the ball hard, and it went down into the creek, which is nasty. And one of our boys just ran down in the creek. I keep saying creek. My wife told me not to say creek. Ran down in the creek. And he picked up the ball, and he brought it back up. And when he brought it up, literally everybody was just staring at him. Like, for real? The residents of La Cuenca were looking at him. We were looking at him. And it said, Josh, why did you do that? He said, well, it seemed like what Jesus would have done. It's like, whoa, yes, that is awesome. That's what we're talking about today. Hopefully you're at Numbers 21. You had a lot of time to get there, so if you're not there yet, too bad. Starting with verse 4. They traveled from Mount Hor along the route to the Red Sea to go around Edom. But the people grew impatient on the way. They spoke against God and against Moses and said, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There is no bread, there is no water, and we detest this miserable food." Then the Lord sent venomous snakes among them. They bit the people, and many Israelites died. The people came to Moses and said, "We've sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us." So Moses prayed for the people. The Lord said to Moses, "Make a snake and put it on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live." So Moses made a bronze snake and put it up on a pole. Then when anybody was bitten by a snake and looked at the bronze snake, they lived. I confess one of the main reasons I picked this story is because it's really, really weird. It's bizarre. But it really is all about focus. And so to kind of set this up, if you know about it, maybe you don't, Israel is a nation that has been chosen by God to represent God to the world. You see that in all their laws and all their cultural pieces, all that stuff. It is their job to represent God. And so God has this promised land set up for them. They end up not really having the faith to go there. They end up having to roam around the desert for a long time. And when this story happens, we're about 6 months out from them getting in. So this is like almost the end of all their trials and all their struggles. And you get to this point where they're sick of all this walking again. And so you get into this cycle where the Israelites are discouraged, and then all of a sudden they're doubting, and then all of a sudden they just don't want to do this whole God thing at all anymore. And they kind of give up their calling that is to represent God because they lost their focus. And so we're going to walk through this. They have to go around Edom. It's kind of this cultural thing that goes back to something that happened earlier in the book. And they get upset about it. And they're just a little bit discouraged because obviously if you were walking around the desert for that long, you'd probably be sick of it too. And so instead of just being incredibly obedient, saying, "You know what, Moses, that's a great idea, we should just keep walking," they start to grumble. And then, ever so slowly, they start to doubt. And you really start to see that happening when they say, "Why did you bring us out here to die?" And the crazy part about that is, these are people that have literally seen God working in miraculous ways on a fairly regular basis. So we could be a little bit jealous of them. You know, did you ever feel like that? Like, wow, man, if God would just if he would just go poof, and then I could feel like, wow, yeah, God's doing this. Like, they had that. And yet they get to this point where they're discouraged, and they're doubting, and they're grumbling, and they're upset, and they start to just kind of turn away from God altogether. And if you grew up in Sunday school, you know that the universal answer for people who don't honor God is Israel. They're always messing up. They're always not doing what they should. And this is kind of the cycle that we're following. So they're slowly trading their focus to what they're discouraged about, to what they're doubting about. Get where I'm going with this? You guys ever been there? I get there a lot. Probably more than I should. Now, when I get there, I make sure I do it really bad. So this is a story. This is me up here on the far side of the picture there. If you know a little bit about me, maybe you do, I went to this camp for boys that were sent to us by the state. It was basically like a alternative to juvenile detention sort of thing. And I went there super excited about representing Jesus all the time. It was like, man, I'm gonna go there. I'm gonna wake up every day. I'm gonna just show these kids Jesus all the time. And it was tough because they would run you through the ringer and make sure that you proved yourself a lot. And so it was a challenge. One of the things that we would do a lot of times is take hiking trips. And so this picture is on one of those hiking trips. We were doing 110, 120 miles in North Carolina. So it takes 3 weeks. It takes a long time. You plan it all out. You know how many miles you're going to do in a day. You know what meals you're going to have at what campsite. You know everything. It's all in a book. It's all planned out. Everybody has it so that things go according to plan. Now, the thing that made this ministry was when these boys had problems or when they had struggles or when they had arguments or when they got into fights, everything stopped and you simply focused on getting that problem solved. Fantastic ministry. Sometimes you were up all night until somebody could say to somebody else, "Hey, I'm sorry," and then they could say, "I forgive you," and then we could talk about how Jesus does that for us on a regular basis. And we got to see this really change kids' lives in really amazing ways. And so one of those situations came up on this trip. And so I wake up, do my morning devos, get all pumped, get excited about teaching kids something. We're going to have a great day. We're going to get these kids closer to serving the Lord. And Dan, one of the campers, just says, I don't feel like rolling up my sleeping bag today. Which is seems like not a big deal, but in that situation, it's a pretty big deal. You have to roll up your sleeping bag. So I was like, all right, guys, let's get together. Let's talk about this. So we get together, we talk about it. Dan is still upset. Dan starts to curse out the group. Dan starts to scream. Dan starts to complain. And so I'm like, all right, man, I can show Jesus to this guy. I can handle this, And we just put the time in. Well, breakfast starts to turn a lot closer to lunch. And if you've ever done a long hiking trip, you know that you got to get certain miles in. And if breakfast turns into lunch and you miss a whole morning of hiking, that's a serious problem. And so I tell everybody, you know what? We're not going to wait for Dan much longer. We're just going to pack up. We're going to hit the trail. And we're going to get out of here. And so we head down the trail a little bit further against what I thought we should do. And Dan starts to get really violent. And so we get him calmed down. We sit down right in the middle of the trail. And we start talking through the problem again. And at this point, I'm like, yeah, I'd really like to represent Jesus, but I'd really like to just keep walking too. Maybe I can try to do both. And then it becomes more and more and more and more evident that I'm getting really, really frustrated with this because we're not getting anywhere. And so Dan, in one moment of extreme anger, screams out, I don't need you guys anymore. My life would be better without you. And that's when I just totally give up on being focused on Jesus altogether. And I say, you know what, Dan, you're right. You should just go that way. Now, if you have any students in youth group, you're concerned because I am now right? I've grown a lot. I've learned a lot. That was a bad decision. But in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, I'll sit here for a little while. And then, I'll hide in the bushes or something. I'll send the group down there. Dan will be walking along in 20 minutes. I can work it out. Ha, caught ya. Let's go. Well, as I'm waiting, time just keeps ticking by, and Dan is gone. And so I realize this is a problem. So I run down the trail to try to find him, and he's nowhere. So then I have to stop and turn around and run the other way to catch the group and say, hey, hold it, I think we lost Dan. And so I tell them that, they wait. I call the camp director, I call search and rescue in North Carolina, and we end up on this crazy day-long search and rescue for Dan. The whole day ends with me in a fire truck driving 20 miles away. It's about 5 o'clock, and Dan's walking down the road. And so the fire truck pulls up to Dan. I roll down the window, and I'm like, hey, man, what are you doing? And he says, you told me to leave. In which case, everybody in the fire truck looks at me like I'm an absolute idiot. I traded my focus because things got kind of difficult. And that created incredible problems because Dan was already, a little bit emotionally unstable. He needed stability in his life. And here I am saying, you know what, I'm willing to represent Jesus. And I showed him that Jesus says, just disappear. And it took me forever to get that back because everybody remembered it. So I lost my focus because I was discouraged, because I was doubting. Have you ever been there? Maybe you never lost somebody, but maybe it's at school. Maybe it's at work. Maybe it's at church. Are you ever in a position where you get discouraged and it's like, okay, you know what, this is getting kind of tough. And then you come to a place where you start to doubt, maybe this isn't really what I should be doing. Maybe there's something that's a lot easier. Maybe you're there right now. The really exciting thing is that the story doesn't end there. It's that God reaches out to them and he starts to refocus them. And he does this in this bizarre way where all these snakes come out. That's why it's called Snakes on a Plane. There's no Samuel L. Jackson here this morning, but there is There's snakes. It's a big desert plain, yeah. God sends these snakes because why? Snakes demand your focus, right? Like if there's snakes in here, you guys are going to notice pretty quickly. And then he makes this provision for Moses to create this snake on a pole, stick it up in the air, and it just simply says, if they were bitten by a snake, they looked and they lived. What is that? That's faith. It's faith. I like to think of it as like if you get bit by a snake, it actually like hangs on you. So like, are people being bitten with snakes hanging on them and realizing, I need to look to this pole. I need to look to God. My faith is what's going to bring me through this, and it does. And not only does it do that, I imagine it becomes this part of the culture where you can ask, hey, Grandpa, is that story about the snakes really true? Yeah, it is. Like God delivered us. And so God refocuses them. Now, if you notice, if you're super observant, the passage that was read this morning was John 3:14 through 17. And it's Nicodemus talking to Jesus about who he is. And Jesus uses this story to explain himself. So Jesus draws this same imagery. I'm on this pole. You can look to me. You can live. And really, that whole snake on a pole thing is representing Jesus. And what's exciting about that is that's how we in Elizabethtown are part of this story. Because I'm assuming most of us have come to that point where we've looked and we've lived. Now, if you haven't, let me just set this up for you. This story about the Israelites in the Old Testament, okay? They have been pulled out of slavery by God. They have seen a sea split open by God. They walk across on dry land because God lets them do it. God made a way for them that is just incredible and amazing, and God makes a way for us that's the same way. The same God that can do all these miraculous and powerful things is the same God that we're worshiping here this morning. Sometimes it's a little bit easy to kind of forget that and lose that perspective, but it's the same God we're dealing with today. And he loves us, and he cares for us, and he's making a way for us, just like he made a way for Israel in that story. He's making a way for us here today. And so if you haven't done that, look and live. That whole John 3 piece is about Jesus coming, loving the world, making a way for sinners to embrace a life with him. You can do that. My guess is most of us have probably already done that. And so the question is, what does that look like for us at EBIC today if we've already made that commitment? If you're discouraged, if you're doubting, if you're in a hard place, refocus. Put your eyes on Jesus. Worship Jesus. Be thankful for Jesus. Be thinking about Jesus. Be representing Jesus. One of the cool things that I think it was Kira said was that she's striving to understand or show that Jesus is at work all the time in everything in her life. Another thing Kira said at youth group on Monday night was that a lot of times we want to have this checklist and think that God is number one on the checklist. And that's good, that's great. But really, God is a part of every single thing on the checklist. So when you wake up in the morning, you get your kids ready for school, we want to represent God in that. We want to show God in that. When you go to school, when you're interacting with other students, we want to show God in that. We want to be so focused that it's transformative, that we're showing people God all the time. Paul takes this then another step. And he's talking in 2 Corinthians about what it means to have that sharp focus to represent who Jesus is. It says, all of this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. that God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them. And he has committed to us the message of reconciliation. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. What does it mean to be an ambassador? An ambassador is somebody who represents something much bigger than what they are. An ambassador is somebody who has been specifically chosen to represent a concept, an idea, a place, a people that is like way bigger. And when you're an ambassador chosen from a people to represent that people, you can't hide it when you're in a different culture. So this idea of being an ambassador is a big deal. And Paul is challenging the Corinthians in this letter, but he's challenging us to do that. We can be ambassadors. To be an ambassador, you have to be focused on what you represent. Which brings us back to these pictures. Most of us have made a commitment to Jesus. Most of us are excited to serve him, have him as an important piece in our life. But the question is, how sharp is that focus right now? Because the point of the two pictures is that they have the same thing. The same content is in both. We're not going to dig into this like way deep, but Jesus can be like these pictures. I mean, we can interact with Jesus like these pictures. And it's really easy for him to become something in the shot that's not super necessarily really clear. He's still there. And if you've made that commitment to Christ, he's there. But how sharp is the focus? How well do you represent him on your day-to-day walk and life, and what does he look like? When I was telling Dan just to leave, go somewhere else, Jesus was pretty foggy in the frame. I mean, I'm a servant of Jesus, but I wasn't really representing Jesus. So, what does that look like for you? What does that look like for you today? Do you need to resharpen that focus? Do you need to think a little bit more about what it means to be an ambassador? I just read a really cool story, I guess, about this church that had out front of the church, there was this giant statue of Jesus, and he had his arms stretched out. And some vandals came in the middle of the night, and they just cut his arms off. I'm not really sure what you do with giant Jesus arms. But the pastor, in response, everybody came to church wondering, how are we going to respond to this? Jesus doesn't have any arms. And in response, he had a plaque made that said, Jesus doesn't have any arms if you don't want to be them. And he put them out front, and he put it on the statue, and now when people see it, it's like this idea that we've got to be the hands and feet of Jesus. We've got to do it. And that is the awesome responsibility that's given to us as ambassadors. It's the awesome responsibility that's given to us as trusting in Christ. We can be God's hands and feet. We really can. And he can empower us to do that. That's what God was doing for the Israelites way back when. He's parting the Red Sea so that they can go to where he wants them to go, so that he can represent him. He's enabling them to do it. We are Christ's ambassadors in E-Town. So what does that look like? What does that look like? At what point does hearing this sermon become actually being Christ's ambassadors? I think it has a lot to do with what happens out there, not in here. And so look and find tangible and clear and compassionate ways to be those hands and feet, to be those ambassadors. Be an ambassador when you go to school. Be an ambassador when you get your kids ready for school. Be an ambassador when you come home from a long, hard day at work and you're dealing with your wife and your kids that have all kinds of other things going on. Or husband and kids. Be an ambassador here at church. Be an ambassador walking down the street. Be an ambassador when you log on to Facebook or Snapchat or Instagram or all the other weird ones. Be an ambassador. Like, really find real, tangible, concrete ways to be hands and feet. Don't just talk about it. Because we love to do that, right? Like, we're really, really good at talking about it. And so we'll give you our opinion, but then what does it look like to put arms and legs on that opinion? That's where you become an ambassador, where all of a sudden there's this amazing, incredible, God-filled action that's part of what you're talking about. And that's what people looking for Jesus desire and long to see, that we really are bringing this true Christ-filled love to their lives. That's why I told you the story about Josh in Costa Rica. If you knew Josh, you'd realize that it was very, very surprising that his answer was, well, I just figured that's what Jesus would do. And so Josh goes on this trip really just wanting to have a good time. You know, he's not one that's necessarily excited about evangelism. Like on the prayer walk, he's like, dude, for real? We're doing a prayer walk? Like, what does this even do? But then all of a sudden, in this incredible, amazing moment, he chases a soccer ball down a hill into literal junk, sewage, garbage, muck, and he just brings it up out and lays it on the field and ready to keep playing. That is what Jesus has called us to do. And when our focus is incredibly honed in on Him, we can be empowered to do that. To go that extra mile out of our comfort zone. Because to be honest, most of us on this prayer walk are feeling, like we can pray, we can do that. But He's willing to go that extra mile, that extra step, to where even the people in the community are like, for real? You're going to do that? So hopefully we can be encouraged, we can be excited,